What is the most valuable resource in a war? If we were asked this question, I'm sure we would all have many doubts. Is it the soldiers? The amount of military equipment perhaps? Perhaps the technology? There is probably no clear answer, but in the end, what do you want me to say? It's the real live people who pick up the guns, fly the drones, or operate the attack system of a frigate. Maybe in a few years, artificial intelligence will change all this. But right now, the situation is still basically the same. You only need to look back at the war in Ukraine to see this very clearly. The number of troops, and more importantly, of well-trained troops, still counts. And you know what? If we stick to the number of active soldiers, we may be in for a surprise or two, with some countries that we all consider to be true war titans. A very obvious case is that of Israel, a country of barely 9.5 million inhabitants, whose armed forces are not even among the top 30 in the world in terms of available troops. We're talking about 170,000 troops, counting the young people who are doing their military service right now. But wait a minute. Haven't we seen in all the media outlets that the Israeli government prepared the deployment of almost 500,000 men following the Hamas attack on the 7th of October 2023? Yes, the thing is that the Israeli military has one very unusual characteristic. They are one of the armed forces with the highest ratio of reservists to available troops. In other words, Israel's secret lies in its powerful reserve of military personnel. This allows the government, in an emergency situation, to more than triple its available troops to a military of more than 500,000 men. A true feat for such a relatively small country. And so, after the October attacks, the government did not hesitate to mobilize 360,000 reservists. This, added to the 170,000 regular armed forces personnel, amounted to more than 500,000 soldiers serving in the armed forces. We are therefore talking about a more than considerable margin for action. If necessary, Israel can quickly build up gigantic armed forces. And yes, I know, the reserve concept is not unique to Israel. Not at all. It is a very common feature of most of the world's armies. Of course, in the case of Israel, they take it to the extreme, both in terms of internal mobilization and in the calling up of thousands of young people around the world.
Je pense qu'on était bien préparé à l'armée après 3 ans de service militaire et j'ai vu beaucoup de trucs. Je pense que je suis bien prête pour la guerre et Dieu est avec nous et tout va bien se passer et voilà.
J'ai pas eu de papier, mais c'est-à-dire tous mes amis, ils ont reçu un message sur WhatsApp et ils se sont tous déplacés dans l'instant.
Of course, this enormous capacity to mobilize military personnel also brings with it some problems. Young people on the front lines obviously cannot work at the same time.
About 70% of tech firms face operating difficulties amid reservists' call-up. Israel considers reducing reserve forces due to high economic costs. Universities still set to start December 31st, but reservists to have staggered return.
It is evident that such a large deployment cannot be maintained for long, except in cases of large-scale warfare. In any case, if one thing seems clear, it is that we are facing one of the great secrets of the powerful IDF, Israel's defense forces. And that scenario has made us at VisualPolitik ask ourselves a few questions. What are the characteristics that make the IDF reserves so special? How do they work? Who is involved in them? And what role exactly do they play in this country's military capability? Well, we're going to discover all this and more as we go on. So let's get started. For today's adults, especially for young Westerners, military service, let alone the possibility of having to participate in a war, seems a totally improbable scenario. Practically far-fetched. Even so, this is not the case in all countries. And no, this time I am not referring to Ukraine, or at least not only Ukraine. Take for example the case of South Korea, which given the constant tension it lives under with its northern neighbor, has been forced to have a strict, compulsory military service for all young men in the country for decades. And that's not all. After completing the service, all South Korean men are included in the reserve forces. That means, after military service, they are included for 4 years in what is known as the mobilization reserve, and then another 4 years in the national reserve. In total, all young South Korean men have to spend at least 8 years linked to the South Korean armed forces. Then another case, perhaps less well known, is that of the Estonian Defense League. This is a corps that includes volunteers and reservists who join it after completing military service. It has about 18,000 troops, and we will soon tell you all about it here on VisualPolitik, so don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. Meanwhile, we can also find the case of the Finnish Territorial Forces, created in 2007 to bring together young people who will complete their military service, and thus integrate them into national defense training in order to keep their combat profile up to date. Because the objective of all these corps is not only to have more troops available, but also that these troops are trained and prepared for combat. That's why there are regular drills and exercises. Be that as it may, we can find several cases similar to South Korea, Estonia, and Finland. But when we take a look at the Israeli reservists, then we can see big differences. First of all, Israeli reservists are usually required to undergo training and equipment refresher days on a much more regular basis than most reservists in the world. This is because the corps is designed not to support the regular army, but to engage directly in combat when necessary. Then another important difference is that Israeli reservists are not intended simply to participate as infantrymen. Rather, they are counted on for such complex tasks as flying planes and helicopters, conducting special operations, and commanding ships. In other words, they have to be fully trained and up to date at all times. And VisualPolitik community, although it may vary according to rank or profession, on average, an Israeli citizen, after completing military service, which is almost 3 years in the case of men, and 2 in the case of women, has to remain a reservist until the age of 40. In other words, an Israeli spends on average more than 20 years in the armed forces. I guess uniforms must take up almost as much space as civilian clothes in their closets. Nevertheless, the situation in this combatant corps has changed a lot in recent years, to the point that today, this entire military structure in Israel could be under threat. What do we mean? Well, listen up.
A vocation full of holes.
It is not usually given much prominence, but the truth is that motivation and the way a conflict is perceived is an absolutely crucial factor in the operation of the armed forces. Well, according to the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, IDF reservists have 4 main motivations that make them a real handful. First, the survival of Israeli society itself. Every soldier, every reservist in this country understands that the fight is key to ensuring the security not only of their country, but of their own families. Then there is the ideological motivation of wanting to defend a way of life and a national identity that they see as endangered. The fact that Israel's enemies often point to their Jewish belief means that the IDF's mission is not only to preserve the state, but also to defend its values and culture. Third, there is the normative motivation. Yes, it sounds very nice to say that soldiers are motivated by patriotic sentiment, but there is no alternative anyway. Military service and reserve participation are mandatory. So if you have to go into combat for your own good, you better be prepared, don't you think? And fourth and finally, we have the individual motivations. In Israel, the value of military service is transmitted within the families themselves. This means that many young people have completely naturalized this service. There are probably few cases in the world where this issue is so naturalized among young people. Even so, the truth is that these motivations have been undergoing a very considerable metamorphosis in recent decades, or at least they were doing so up until the last major Hamas attack. In recent years, the percentage of Israelis in favor of ending compulsory military service has surpassed those against such a change. A historic turning point occurred in 2020. Just 7 years ago, almost 6 out of 10 Jewish Israelis were opposed to the idea of eliminating the draft, which of course would also change the reserve itself a lot. However, as of 2020, the majority will be on the opposite side. We will see what happens now, following the Hamas attack. But in any case, it seems clear that support for the draft is falling sharply. And keep in mind that, surprisingly enough, the age group most supportive of this change is Israelis between the ages of 25 and 34. That is, Israelis who have already completed their military service and who will now be largely in the reserve. It is clear that they did not like the experience. But is it that they no longer consider the military as something necessary for guaranteeing the survival of the Hebrew state? Well, no, it's not that either. It's just that the lifestyle has changed, and that is putting a lot of pressure on the IDF. Listen up.
New society, same war.
VisualPolitik community, although the logic of military conflicts remains virtually the same, the societies that fuel the battlefields are now very different. Think about it. It is not the same to be called to fight if you are unemployed, or work, let's say delivering newspapers, as it is to be called back to the barracks when you are leading an electromechanical project in a state-of-the-art workshop, or being part of an econometrics team at the university. As your life becomes more comfortable and the professional opportunity cost increases, the idea of having to give up everything to get into a trench, do military service, and risk your life on top of that starts to become less appealing. Or at least you become much more demanding with the conditions. This is something we have already seen in Christopher Nolan's recent film, Oppenheimer. In order to summon the best, it was necessary to offer them 1,001 comforts. Well, the same is happening within the Israeli citizenry, which, in recent decades, has led in several technological and educational indicators, while enjoying enormous prosperity. Given this scenario, several experts have summarized the economic cost of compulsory military service in Israel as if it were a tax, since during the performance of such duty, a citizen earns between 60 and 80% less than what he or she could earn in a civilian job. For example, according to Israel's Ministry of Finance, about 20% of the armed forces reserves work in high-end technology companies. Workers in this field have an average salary that is 47% higher than the national average. As if that were not enough, some studies indicate that employers often choose to select workers who are exempt from having to join the reserve so as not to lose skilled labor in times of war, something that happens very often in Israel.
70% of companies report damage to their functional continuity due to a significant portion of their employees being called up. Repeated reports of reduced functionality even for employees who are not on standby duty.
In this sense, as you can see, it is becoming more and more costly in professional and personal terms to first have to do military service and then have to serve in the reserve, with all that this entails: training, maneuvers, and deployments. In fact, low-income classes traditionally saw military service as a way to climb the social and economic ladder, not only because of the employment opportunities that a military career could offer, but also because the service generated close ties with other recruits from wealthier economic backgrounds, or with more advanced academic profiles. Remember that since military service is compulsory, barracks and units are made up of recruits from very different backgrounds. This was a huge source of career opportunities. You met people who could open doors for you, or with whom you could do business outside your usual circle. However, as prosperity became more widespread in the country, and career opportunities have multiplied, military service has also lost value as a source of career networking opportunity. This goes a long way toward explaining why fewer and fewer Israelis support maintaining this very strong military nature for much of their lives. Now, having said that, the big question remains: how are the reserves performing in the current war scenario? Have all these changes affected their operability on the front lines? Well, let's take a look.
Work in the swamp?
Israeli reservists play a very important role in the war, but they are almost as crucial in the weeks following the fighting. And not surprisingly, since they are not making a career in the armed forces, reservists end up being the main source of complaints and protests against negligent leaders or incautious actions. The clearest example of this was in the Second Lebanon War in 2006, when Israel, in response to a series of Hezbollah attacks, launched a full-scale offensive on Lebanese territory. An offensive that ended, surprisingly, with an inconclusive result. Well, as soon as the hostilities ended, thousands of reservists protested about wrong attitudes, failed strategies, and an an insufficient flow of resources at the front, which provoked a whole political crisis.
The reservists, most of whom have returned to civilian life, say their training was inadequate and that they were sent to Lebanon with unclear missions, inadequate supplies, obsolete equipment, and a lack of basics, such as drinking water. They called for a national inquiry into how the war was fought.
This had two consequences. On the one hand, the reservists acted as a kind of driver of change and audit of failures. They were a key factor in keeping the armed forces from resting on their laurels. If military service ceases to be compulsory and this reserve disappears, at least as it is known today, this channel of improvement feedback would disappear. But that is not all. The huge wave of protests and denunciations provoked by the 2006 crisis meant that reservists began to be diverted, especially to routine security activities such as customs, border control, and public order surveillance in the occupied areas. In other words, fewer and fewer reservists are called to the front lines, except in the very special cases of pilots or essential specialists. As a result, this control work has already begun to be reduced in recent years. The fact is that, as you can see, all these changes are jeopardizing what has, so far, been one of the IDF's great strengths. Of course, the Hamas attack may change this trend in the short and medium term. For instance, the government is now considering extending both military service and time in the reserves, stretching the times of retirement and operation activity. But all in all, you can't stop progress. So everything indicates that the claims against military service will continue to gain adherents sooner or later in Israeli society. If that were not the case, and the Hamas attack had provoked a change of trend, this would be one of the biggest defeats this group would have suffered. Time will tell which scenario we are in. For now, the question is over to you. Do you think that the Hamas attack and the offensive in Gaza will change the growing unpopularity of military service? How would you deal with this situation? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's open a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you for being there, all the best, and see you next time.